So there is a philosophy called humanism that emerged in the 20th century that is well explained in the Humanist Manifesto of 1933. Its first two sentences state, "The manifesto is a product of many minds. It was designed to represent a developing point of view, not a new creed." This has a nice ring for us non-creedal Unitarians, which should not be surprising given that 15 of its original 34 signers, almost half of them, were Unitarians, including John Dietrich, the minister of our Spokane congregation from 1911 to 1916. Dietrich went on to become known as the father of religious humanism. Humanism is one of only two major philosophies to have emerged from the United States, the other being pragmatism. And its founder, John Dewey, was also a signer of the Humanist Manifesto. I won't go into the contents of the manifesto, since this is not really the humanism that I want to talk about today, but its original 15 explanatory statements are worth being reminded of and can easily be found online if you're interested. I mention it now because it seems to be what most people today think humanism refers to, including most Unitarians who should know better, but don't. And I believe that this is because the Unitarian Universalist Association and many of the ministers that it has credentialed over the years have resented this core tenet of our liberal religious heritage and have failed to talk much about it in our congregations, hoping to replace it with what philosopher Harry Frankfurt calls bullshit. I'm referring to the dilution and supplanting of our tradition with nonsense borrowed from other religions and beliefs that accept fantastical and impossible ideas about the history, the world, and reality. Frankfurt says, "It is just this lack of connection to a concern with truth, this indifference to how things really are, that I regard as the essence of bullshit." Now, I know that's not very you of me to say, but it is very Unitarian of me to say. And I will remind you that when this congregation was founded in 1887, its bylaws stated that the authority of its belief is reason, the method of finding its beliefs is scientific, its aim is to crush superstition and establish the facts of religion. Back then, Unitarians knew what our religion was about and what it stood for. No BS about it. But over the years, I have often heard people, including visitors to our church, ask, "Isn't Unitarianism that religion that believes in everything?" No, I say, it's the religion that doesn't believe in much of anything. And I think this confusion, even among Unitarians, is an unintended consequence of the 1961 merger of Unitarianism with Universalism, which for those who aren't very logical is different from me saying it is the fault of Universalism. In my book, The Gadfly Papers, I write, "Universalism has died and has been displaced by a grotesque impostor in its place. Unitarianism, though muted, still lives, but must break free from the bonds that now restrain it if it is going to survive." It has been since the merger that both of these centuries-old traditions have become increasingly detached from their historic roots and distinctiveness. Universalism, a religion once defined by its belief in the universal brotherhood of humankind and in the universal love of God, has come to mean the simple acceptance of all religions, and nowadays, just about any nutty idea one claims to have. Unitarianism, on the other hand, has been increasingly muted because of its historic insistence on dealing with reality and accepting only the ideas that pass the test of science and reason. These days, sadly, anti-rationalism is a stronger force in Unitarian Universalism than its rationalist heritage. To be clear, I identify as a Unitarian, not as a Universalist, and certainly not as a UU. Not anymore. But I hold no animus toward Universalism. Still, some have written to me in defense of Universalism, and remarkably, they have done so by distinguishing it from Unitarianism, which I think is great. That's my goal, to help rediscover the distinct theological roots and singular qualities of both of these old, centuries-old, venerable traditions, and to distinguish them from the new religious movement, the NRM, as researchers call it, known as Unitarian Universalism, which has become increasingly illiberal and antithetical to the principles its namesakes are supposed to represent. According to Dietrich's biographer, Carlton Wilston, who also happens to have been his spouse, and I have a signed copy by both of them, if you can believe that. Yeah, I just ordered a used copy and it came and it was signed by both of them. It's amazing, right? Yeah. So it was in 1915, while Dietrich was still in Spokane, that he began constantly using the term humanism, according to Winston, in referring to his religious belief. David Park's 1957 book, The Epic of Unitarianism, says that catching the scientific and anti-supernaturalist currents of the day, humanism voiced them as a new world religion for modern man. Its first advocates were the Reverend John H. Dietrich in Spokane, Washington, and his best friend, the Reverend Curtis Reese in Des Moines, Iowa. Reese also happened to come to the tradition as a Southern Baptist, as I did, and was a student at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, as were Peggy and I. So Park's book also says that Dietrich and Reese began preaching humanism in 1913. That's 3 years before he left Spokane. Dietrich came to Spokane in 1911 again, immediately after having been convicted of heresy by the Dutch Reformed Church, but he was accused of being a Unitarian by one of his parishioners as early as 1905, and deep down he probably was. He got in trouble in college for writing a paper that treated the death of Jesus as merely a human event resulting from his political actions, not an act of atonement for the sins of the world. He also called upon others to emulate Jesus' behavior rather than worshiping him. That's as a college student. He definitely was in the wrong religion initially. According to Winston, afterward, when a young reporter at the Spokesman here in Spokane learned that Dietrich had become a Unitarian, he immediately contacted our church. Winston says some other church would snap him up, the reporter feared, if the Spokane church did not act immediately. And it did. But the rest is not quite history. Dietrich may have come to us as a Unitarian, but not yet as a humanist. This evolution in his thinking not only happened while he was here in Spokane, as the evidence proves, but I would further suggest because he came to Spokane, where his mind and his inclinations were set free by our extraordinarily liberal congregation's fundamental regard for truth, based upon reason and science, and its complete rejection of superstitious thinking. As our original bylaws, drafted in 1888, say, its first principle is freedom of opinion and is subject to no censure for heresy. Got to be a great place for a heretic to come, right? In fact, Dietrich was inspired to use the term humanism after reading it in an article about positivism that was mentioned on the back of a book given to him by one of our early church members. Positivism, loosely defined as the religion of humanity, which the article's author shortened to just humanism, struck a chord with Dietrich. This age-honored word, Winston writes, would be a good name for his interpretation of religion in contrast to theism. In short, Dietrich came to believe religion ought to be based on the betterment of humanity, while theism based it on a belief in God. That's the beginning of Dietrich's journey as the founder of religious humanism, which a lot of Unitarians caught on to, especially those in the western reaches of the U.S., even the furthest reaches of the U.S., as in here in Spokane. However, it wasn't met with complete enthusiasm and actually led to a major controversy in our religion known as the humanist debate, or the humanist controversy. As William F. Schultz, a former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association and executive director of Amnesty International, explained in a 2003 article, for more than a decade, from 1916, when Dietrich and another Unitarian colleague, the Reverend Curtis Reese, began preaching humanism to their congregations, through the 1920s, Unitarians debated the merits of a strictly human-centered, scientifically minded, ethically focused religion. Can you imagine a minister from our congregation causing such a nationwide debate within our entire religion? What are the chances? So that's a lot of history, and I haven't really even gotten to my main point. But to get there, it's important to understand that the origins of the philosophy called humanism that began in the early 20th century, right here in our own congregation, within the much longer historical context from which it sprang. Not only the unflinching commitment to reason and science that our congregation in particular was founded upon, right before Dietrich got here, but the belief in human goodness, human agency, and human welfare that has always, that's a big word, always been integral to the definition of Unitarianism, dating all the way back to Jesus. I believe Unitarianism is so deeply rooted in and defined by these fundamental principles that it was inevitable that humanism as a formal philosophy would emerge from it. Dietrich was inevitable. He may be considered the father of religious humanism, but theologically speaking, Unitarianism is almost synonymous with the term and always has been. For Unitarianism is essentially the belief that Jesus was human. A human being, not a God, which necessitates a positive belief in his humanity and his humanitarian teachings that put human love and welfare at the center of all our endeavors. It should also be remembered that Jesus and his original followers were Jewish, not Christian. Christianity is a religion that did not exist during Jesus' time. So his humanistic message initially existed within the context of Judaism, which is a religion defined by monotheism, the belief in one God. It is a Unitarian theology. Sometime after his death, non-Jews were also drawn to his teachings, and like his Jewish followers, they did not initially consider Jesus a God, but a wise teacher who gave us some good words to live by. His original followers, therefore, had what's called a low Christology, which I prefer to call a humanistic Christology, because a low Christology simply emphasizes the humanity of Jesus and his humanistic teachings. A high Christology, which emerged much later, emphasizes the Christ of faith and the belief that he is divine. The latter view emerged decades after his death as some of his Gentile followers, who had no cultural or religious restrictions or taboos about deifying and worshiping human beings. came to consider Jesus to be a God, whom the Romans called Christ, for which they were called Christians. At this point, whether from a low or high or a human or a divine perspective, his humanity and humanistic teachings existed within the context of Christianity, right? Worshipping him as a God, however, emphasized his divinity and the preposterous myths about him, while largely disregarding the historical Jesus, the human Jesus, along with his humanity and the humanity in his teachings. Soon thereafter, the original Unitarian belief that there is only one God and therefore Jesus was only human, could only be human, became anathema. Right? In 325 CE, the Holy Roman Empire, having adopted Christianity as the official state religion, established the Nicene Creed, declaring that the Father and the Son are the same person. Just over half a century later, they added the Holy Spirit to the mix, and the Trinitarian doctrine was born in reaction against Unitarianism. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost was born, and the Unitarian insistence on Jesus' humanity became heresy to even discuss. So always remember, we were here first. It would not be until, again, after the Dark Ages ended with the invention of the printing press, that Unitarianism would be rediscovered, and with it, the humanity of Jesus. When this occurred, Unitarianism existed within the context of the Renaissance, right? So we've gone from Judaism to a Christian context to now a Renaissance context. And the Renaissance, again, refers to a renewal or a renewed interest in the pre-Socratic philosophers who were the first thinkers in history who attempted to understand the world in natural rather than simple supernatural terms. And they discovered a lot of brilliant science during just a couple of centuries, but they were eventually declared pagans, and most of their writings were destroyed by the Catholic Church. But the Renaissance, 800 years after this literary purge and silencing of dissenters, centered, or countered, I should say, with what in Latin is called the studia humanitatis, the study of humanity, right? Including all human writings and teachings that could be found, not just those authorized by the leaders of one religion. And this is what our liberal arts model of higher education is still based on, sadly fading as it is. Today we refer to this principle as Renaissance humanism. Renaissance humanism, attributed to the 14th century Italian scholar Francesco Petrarch, who discovered and printed Cicero's letters, a brilliant Roman philosopher who was not a Christian, yet had many valuable ideas worth considering. For this, Petrarch has been named the father of Renaissance humanism, long before John Dietrich and the Humanist Manifesto existed. So you understand? Humanism existed long before the 20th century philosophy known as humanism. And it's an important point to grasp, that it's not a 20th century invention that infiltrated Unitarianism, leading to a rift in the denomination, as many UUs now believe. Unitarianism rather has always been synonymous with humanistic Christology. And its reverence for historical Jesus' humanity and humanitarian, more importantly, the humanitarian teachings that we should live by. And this has been so going all the way back to the origins of Unitarianism, even if its defining quality endured through different historical contexts, including those that I've mentioned: a Jewish context, a Christian context, the context of Renaissance humanism, from which Eastern European Unitarianism emerged. Formal Unitarianism for the first time during the 16th century, emphasizing religious tolerance, freedom of belief, and freedom of the pulpit. Unitarianism in this part of the world still exists, in this part of the world where our friends are, still exist within a Christian context. They are still Christian churches, along with this historic commitment to the belief in Jesus' humanity and his humanistic values. Western Unitarianism emerged later during the overtly rational and scientific context of the 17th century Enlightenment, when the ideas and values that emerged during the Renaissance became widespread and were finally put into unfettered practice, leading to the establishment of democracies and other social, scientific, and technological innovations that have made our modern lives so wondrous. Some of which the irrationalists are now trying to end, like vaccines. Although Western Unitarianism began within the context of a very liberal Christianity, it went through a transcendentalist phase, beginning in the 19th century, during which its theological lexicon eventually expanded beyond the confines of Christianity, or Christian language, Christian definition. God was no longer the God of Abraham, but a more nebulous oversoul, the oversoul of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And a century later, as I've mentioned at length, came the humanist debate, challenging Unitarians to consider whether we need to speak of God in any terms at all, so long as we are devoted to the welfare of humanity as demonstrated by our actions, not our words. Another way to put it is that 2,600 years ago, the early Greek philosophers became the first group to collectively rely upon reason, sense, and nature to better ascertain truth and understand reality. Relying upon their own human faculties and agency to do so, which necessitates also valuing human dignity, a belief in humanity, a belief in our powers to do something meaningful, to figure it out for ourselves without divine intervention, without magical thinking. 600 years later, a Jewish sect led by an itinerant preacher named Jesus taught that religion ought to be good for humanity, not humanity for religion. And that this principle is put into practice by treating others as we would like to be treated ourselves, and by sharing our wealth and our resources with one another, and by feeding the hungry and healing the sick and caring for the poor, forgiving one another, welcoming the outcast, unclean, and demonized among us, and avoiding violence. All of this is about as humanistic as it gets. As mentioned, this movement's earliest followers were Unitarian in their theology, as are Jews to this day. They have a Unitarian theology, belief in one God. But then came that lengthy historic hiccup that I've spoken of, the Dark Ages, that squelched this focus on human dignity, human agency, and human welfare for more than half a millennium before it reemerged during the Renaissance. The best example is the formal establishment of the Unitarian religion, again in Transylvania, and its Edict of Torda in 1568, the first religious toleration law in human history guaranteeing the freedom to express and choose one's own religion without fear of retribution or punishment. It's remarkable. Intolerance rooted in a commitment to peace, life, and human dignity. And these Renaissance principles inspired the Enlightenment reformers, resulting in the very first articulation of the humanistic ethic, philosopher Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative that no person should ever become a means to somebody else's end, but should be considered an end within themselves. And during the French Revolution, this ethic was reframed to what we recognize More readily today is the inherent worth and dignity of every person, a phrase that is included within the founding articles of many of the world's democracies that followed. And this ethic was later given a more in-depth explanation with the establishment of the 20th century humanist philosophy, Dietrich's religious humanism in particular, and its Humanist Manifesto. As the Humanist Manifesto's 13th affirmation states, religious humanism maintains that all associations and institutions exist for the fulfillment of human life. That's the humanistic ethic. But these days I prefer social psychologist Erich Fromm's mid-20th century definition of the humanistic ethic, that the sole criterion of ethical value must be human welfare, and that the unfolding and growth of every person should be the aim of all social and political activities. Human welfare and individual development, that is, ought to be the fundamental aim of all we do. And this definition gets at both the bottom and top halves of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Too many times a society focuses on one half or the other, right? And communist, socialist countries do pretty good at getting the lower half taken care of, but they forget the upper half, the need to self-actualize and become ourselves and to be free. And Western capitalist societies tend to focus more on the upper ability, but forget about the basic needs we need before we even can begin to think about becoming our better selves, our higher selves. So this is the humanistic ethic is very well balanced in that, and particularly the way Fromm phrases it, because it requires us to concentrate on general human welfare and individual growth, individual fulfillment, individual development. And for those who are wondering, because I get this a lot, I say it almost every time I speak on humanism, but would you please just let it sink in this time? This is really important to understand, okay? For those who are wondering about other living beings, please do not confuse humanism with anthropocentrism. Humanism recognizes that we are not separate from our environment, not unrelated to the creatures that we share our world with or to the world itself, and that our health and welfare depends upon theirs. Okay? That's the bottom half, right? Human welfare. For human beings as a whole to be well, we need to have a healthy environment and a healthy relationship with other creatures. That's the lower half. It also understands that no individual can fully unfold without developing a great love of life in all its forms and the capacity to empathize with the suffering of all living beings. That's the upper half. To become fully ourselves, to gain the power of our humanity, is to become lovers of life and to empathize with all living beings. And this is why, for example, we often call those who care for animals the Humane Society, and those who are cruel to other living beings as inhumane. Being human. And by the way, I'm going to go off script a little bit here. It is an interesting question, how does humanism leaves out, it's a concern, right? Humanism leaves out non-humans, which is not true, but it's an interesting concern. What other animals on earth do you think about the welfare of human beings? Or the welfare of any other animals outside of the maternal instinct or parental instinct to care for those that they need to survive to pass on their genetic information, right? I mean, as far as this is a completely human question, our relationship to beings that are not like us, let alone our relationship to beings that are like us, sadly, right? So no other animals ask that question or consider that question that we know of. It is a humanistic question. It comes from the maturity of a species that somehow acknowledges we have a relationship with those who are not like us. It's really interesting. The research shows that most other animals, well, all other animals that we know of, they recognize their own species in nature and get along with them unless they are put in unnatural circumstances, like their habitat has been encroached upon by humans, they're put in a zoo, but otherwise they get along well, but yet not usually with other animal species, right? They become prey or predator relationships. But humans have long had relationships with other species, sometimes brutal, sometimes loving. It's a very unique relationship. So the question about our responsibility to other species is a very humanistic question, a very human concern. Okay, back to the sermon. Only got 3 more pages, so no, I'm kidding. Almost done. So the point that I've really been leading to with all of this history is that humanism, in the broad sense, is not a modern interloper into Unitarianism, but has always been integral and intertwined with it. With its very definition, broadly defined as a belief in human goodness, agency, and dignity, and a commitment to human well-being and flourishing through the social technologies of freedom, reason, and tolerance. Humanism has been the one and the only quality. Humanism has been the one and only quality that has remained constant throughout the different historical contexts in which Unitarianism has existed. In its Jewish context, its Christian context, its Renaissance context, its Enlightenment context, its Transcendentalist context, and its 20th century humanist philosophy and religious humanistic context. It always goes back to the strain of humanism, the welfare of humanity. Now, I won't try to give an appropriate name for whatever the hell the context is in which Unitarianism exists today, other than perhaps the term that defined by Harry Frankfurt that I mentioned earlier. But if it is to survive, and if it is to remain worth surviving, if Unitarianism is to survive, and if it is to remain worth surviving, that's another question. Unitarianism must again gaze upon the North Star that has guided it throughout time and through every storm, lest this historic and venerable tradition, unlike any other ever to existed, really does become the religion that believes everything. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.